This script has been in my backlog for so long I'd forgotten it was there. In general, I don't like to cover one series too much. Mostly because it keeps things from getting stagnant, and because I am to consistency what a politician is to promises. Since I've gotten the primary review of the series out of the way, I can touch on some of the smaller stuff I find interesting about the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. This also means I can speculate. But before I start with what will inevitably get me some angry comments and start some spectacular internet fights, I hope, a message from this video's sponsor, me. My next book, Battle Games Book 1, is out. It's a continuation of my Battle Games series. It follows a group of professional athletes in a sport using sword-shaped stun batons to compete in various challenges, engage in melee combat, and defeat colorful weirdos from across the world. It's a weird concept I'm having some fun with. If you would like to read my work or just critique what I do, I will post a link in the description. I welcome all comments and criticisms, as this is how I grow as a writer. On with the video. So it goes without saying, the scenarios I'm suggesting here are based on what I think would happen and what I've taken from the books. If you've read the A Song of Ice and Fire books, you'll know how important religion is to the story. This being a world where magic is real and some of it is tied to religion. This video is for the books only. I will not be covering things that are show exclusive, as I've never seen it. There are 3 major religions vying for dominance over the continent of Westeros. Each have their own strengths, weaknesses, starting points, and I'm curious, if it came down to it, who would win a holy war? So let's break these religions down, look into their strengths and weaknesses, other quirks, properties, and proclivities that may or may not play a role in winning the hearts, minds, and castles of Westeros. Then we'll explore where the war could start and who would win. We'll start with the newcomer. The religion of Red Rahola, a name that is considerably easier to read than say. This religion follows the deity of its namesake. The Red God has the domain of light, fire, and shadow, and stands opposed to the Other. The Other is a nebulous and little-known being. To be very basic about it, we're told he's the opposite of the Red God, and is bad in all the ways that the Red God is good. Yes, I'm going to say Red God rather than his name because I can. We are assured that the Other is a false god, and will be brought down by the Lord of Light. You can probably gather from this that the religion of the Red God doesn't play well with others. This religion has its main power base in Essos, a continent to the east of Westeros. Yes, funny naming scheme is funny. Here the Lord of Light is forced to share space with 100 other religions. The followers of the Red God like to burn things and people they disagree with. It's rather hard to make friends when you invite them to be the barbecue. Essos is an intractable place full of hostility, so this is counterbalanced somewhat by everyone else being almost as hostile to change. So what are the benefits of following this religion, other than setting your annoying neighbors on fire and counting that as going to church? Let's look at some of the Acolytes. Melisandre is probably the most notable example. Melisandre has displayed a number of gifts given to her by the Red God. Resistance to heat, cold, and poison, the ability to divine through fire, the ability to literally birth servants of shadow to do her bidding, and the ability to call on the wind by sacrificing someone to the flames. I'm sure she does other stuff in the show, but this is just the books we're covering. Another priest of the Red God, Thoros of Myr, was able to resurrect the dead. Several times, in fact. This is a technical resurrection, and by that I mean the injuries don't go away, they're just not fatal anymore. Then, the man he resurrects, Beric Dondarrion, converts to the religion and was able to create a flaming sword by bleeding on it. Dondarrion then resurrects the long-dead Catelyn Stark at the cost of his artificially prolonged life, creating an abomination that will haunt the countryside in stories for centuries to come, but that's another story and another video. The last priest we'll cover from the book is Markuro. Markuro, as I'm trying to pronounce it, is also able to divine his god's will through the flame. He was able to cure the festering arm of Victarion Greyjoy. Granted, the arm was burnt, blackened, and peeling, but it worked and didn't appear to give the pseudo-Viking any noticeable discomfort. It's probably safe to say that any sufficiently devout priest of the Red God could probably do as these 3 did. 4 if you count Dondarrion. I say this because they all do a lot of similar things, if not exactly the same things. Not counting the birthing of shadow monsters. I don't want to watch a man try that or read about it. There is a catch to these powers. We're given testimony that before the dragons returned to the world, the followers of the Red God were greatly diminished. This leads me, and I'm sure others, to hypothesize that the priests are really doing magic rather than the divine gifts they claim. Also, some of the more extraordinary things, like bringing people back from the dead, literally takes away from the caster's life. Westeros has a few followers of the Red God, but the number is growing. The Knights of the Underhill are probably responsible for most of the growth. Stannis Baratheon and Melisandre have probably been a negative influence, if anything, in the Seven Kingdoms. Things might change if he wins more victories, but he's starting with a tough opponent. The Old Gods. This religion is primarily found in the Neck and the lands north of it. It's the oldest religion on the continent and predates the humans that live there. It was started by a race the humans call the Children of the Forest. We don't get an in-depth explanation of the tenets of the religion. In fact, you could say it's not an organized religion at all. We do know a few of the practices. First, prayers are offered before a heart tree. This is a tree, usually a wirewood, which is a white tree with blood-red leaves, that has a face carved in it. If you follow the Old Gods, all the things important in your life will happen here. Weddings, oaths, prayers, etc. Also, the religion of the Old Gods firmly believe in the laws of hospitality. These are things like the guest's rights and the host rights, whether a person is entitled to vengeance, don't kill your kin, etc. Some of these rules are fairly ubiquitous in Westeros, and you could say that it's a cultural thing rather than a religious one. But some of the actions of the nobles throughout the book may have you doubting that. Guest rights are similar to what we saw in England, Scotland, and Ireland in our own history. Basically, once a guest has eaten of your food and drank of your alcohol, they're under the host's protection. It is considered a great sin to kill your guest, just as it is seen as a great sin to kill your host. The Red Wedding is probably the most famous example of murdering the guests, and the sack of Craster's Keep is the best example of murdering the host. Both were called cursed things by the people who witnessed them and suffered from them. The Old Gods have few priests. Those they do have are natural skin changers called Greenseers. You don't have to be a Greenseer to be a skin changer, but it appears you do have to be a skin changer to be a Greenseer. Greenseers have the power to possess any animal they wish, even several at a time. They can gather intelligence by looking through the eyes of the heart trees, even looking into the past. It is said in the books when the Greenseers were numerous during the War of the First Men, they summoned the ocean to break the arm of Dorne to stop the humans from invading their lands. This would be a stupendous feat, as it was a land bridge that was connecting Westeros to Essos, and was probably several dozen, if not hundreds of miles wide. Brandon Stark and the Three-Eyed Crow are the only living Greenseers in the story so far. The religion has many adherents, but unlike the religion of the Red God, their power is on the wane. Skin changing is a gift that seems exclusive to this religion, but it's a gift that also seems genetic rather than divine. The Old Gods, as it appears in the books, is really just an advanced form of ancestor worship. The souls and minds of the Children of the Forest and the Greenseers live in the network of heart trees that cover the north. This means their power is limited by where the heart trees are, primarily the weirwood trees. There are weirwood trees in castles across the continent with faces, but there are none in the surrounding forests in the south. That being said, the religion is old, its worshippers stubborn, and its integration into the culture of the lands it is practiced is near absolute. They're just not very well organized. The religion of the Seven. Now we reach the religion followed by the majority of the population of Westeros. The worship of the Seven. You would be forgiven for seeing parallels to Christianity, but there are some major differences. The Seven who are one are composed of the Father, the Mother, the Warrior, the Maiden, the Smith, the Crone, and the Stranger. These aspects of God represent the different stations and stages men and women go through in life, with the Stranger representing death. The religion came to Westeros with the Andal invasion. They fought a long bloody war with the followers of the Old Gods. The Andals had an edge as they had steel, and the followers of the Old God had at best iron. After lots of blood was spilled, heart trees were uprooted and new kingdoms were established. Peace was then declared between the warring factions. Part of the truce involved formal recognition of each other's religion. This is seen in almost every major castle having a godswood. So what cool powers come with this religion? None! There are stories of followers like Balin the Blessed surviving multiple snake bites, But there is reason to believe this is more medical than divine intervention. The Seven's power lies in zeal and organization. They believe in hard work and forgiveness. The last one at a price. If you study history, you may know what a galvanizing effect the tenet of forgiveness can have. To reference the real world, one of the reasons Christianity spread like it did is the religion and the responsibility for it became more of a personal thing. You could be forgiven for getting something wrong. In Rome, if you didn't worship the gods of the city, it was the job of the other citizens to punish you, because if they didn't, the gods would punish the city. There was no forgiveness. You followed along, and if you deviated, blasphemed, or insulted the religion or culture, you may find yourself very intimate with a tree. While forgiveness isn't preached as heavily in the religion of the Seven as it is in Christianity, you can definitely see its influence in the books. So let's look at the other religions in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire and their attitudes towards forgiveness. If you follow the religion of the Red God and don't follow the tenets, do something seen as blasphemous, or try to leave the religion, you get fed to the flames. If you break an oath sworn to the old gods, you're likely to get beheaded or forced to live in exile under the threat of it. It is possible in the worship of the Seven too to be beheaded for a grievous sin, but you do have a chance of being absolved. Even minor sins can be forgiven for a price. Usually, and by our standards, it's still pretty brutal, but it's not crippling, and you can usually go about your life afterwards, assuming you aren't executed for something heinous. Both the old gods and the religion of the Seven will allow people to take the black to repent for some crimes. However, if you revisit some of the plots in the book, you'll see that this is used far less frequency in the lands that worship the Seven. This could be accounted for by proximity, but I think there's another explanation. The worship of the old gods is an honor-based religion. They are more severe in their punishments. The religion of the Seven is more organized. Chastising wrongdoers of lesser offenses, and not killing them or forcing them to pledge oaths of service and abstinence, ensures they maintain a higher worshipper base. The oaths of abstinence I'm talking about here are taking the black. The priests and holy men still take oaths of celibacy. The Catholic Church in our own world has a similar policy, but we're not going to go into depth on it. So how does the worship of the Seven survive in a world where other religions give you the prospect of powers? It has a lot to do with their organization and martial nature. One of the aspects of worship in the Seven is that of the warrior. The Church of the Seven did have martial orders, much like the Catholic Church in our own world. These were the Warrior's Sons, a group of ordained knights, and the Poor Fellows, who were made up mostly of the poors. The Poor Fellows were mostly armed with cudgels and tended to guard caravans moving from city to city, as well as guarding priests who were also traveling about. The faith did not just organize martially, they integrated themselves into caring for the dead with the Sisters of Silence, cared for the raising of noble children with the Septas, ensuring they follow the faith. There are even monasteries of good brothers, much like the monks in our own history. Monasteries, the Western kind, are a fun study. For a time they were absurdly powerful, and immediately after, severely hated. The religion also makes room for every station in life, as the different faces of God represent every possibility in life. The religion literally makes everyday work a religious matter. This means that by doing your work you are praising God. By doing your duty and staying in your assigned place, you are right and faithful. The smith does a lot of covering for this, as he can also be referred to as the carpenter or the cooper or any other medieval profession. It is a very strong thing to be represented by your religion and not simply fear it. Now, there is a fourth religion on the continent, but I don't count it as a contender. This is the religion of the Drowned God. Honestly, I think it has too much working against it. First, it gives no advantage to its followers, either social, organizational, or magical. Second, its followers are too few. The Iron Men are a raiding culture that live at the expense of their neighbors. They employ slave labor for most jobs outside of raiding or shipwright. Finally, while it's not explicitly stated, you pretty much have to be born into the religion. This is not an uncommon thing for old religions, but it is a problem when it comes to numbers. The only thing keeping the Iron Men from being wiped out is the disunity on the mainland and the lack of commitment to seizing the Ironborn's land. The Iron Men are likely on borrowed time if they don't see some serious reforms. Now that the contenders are set and our stage is ready, how would the Holy War on Westeros go? As stated before, the Iron Men really don't come into account. Most likely they will harass the other factions until the inevitable victor finishes off the bigger threats, then decides to wipe them out. They may survive for a while if they ally with someone else, but from what we've seen in the book, that's unlikely. They're more likely to seize the opportunity from the chaos that's ensuing on the mainland and try to seize power as they did in the books. The most likely scenario, as I see it, is the religion of the Red God grabbing a strong foothold in Westeros, and the rest spiraling out from there. That means the only real question is where. So let's break it down by general location. The North. If it starts in the north, the foothold will most likely be crushed early. The worshippers of the Old God are a brutal and intractable people. While they tolerate the faith of the Seven, that peace was hard-won, and neither the Red God nor the followers of the Old Gods would tolerate the denigration from the other for very long. The two religions are too incompatible. The followers of the Lord of Light do not tolerate iconography of other religions, and they're not subtle about it. Wherever their foothold was, they would inevitably burn down a god's wood, sacrificing it to their hungry god. This would be seen as not just an affront, but a horrid blasphemy, and would most likely be met with violence. If the war itself didn't end the followers of the Red God, the complete cutoff from trade and aid would probably do it. The followers of the Old Gods would probably most likely harass the New Faith's farmlands and hunting grounds, leaving them with no food for the winter. Then weather and time would reunite the followers of the Lord of Light with their god. Should the foothold be in the south, I believe the followers of the Seven would be much more accepting for much longer. This would allow the followers of the Red God to grow. This would likely continue until the Red God's followers reached a critical mass and could get properly started. Thanks to the Knights of the Underhill, we know the martial culture of the Knights blends well with the worship of the Red God. I believe exposure to the south of Westeros would change the nature of the Red God's religion. There would be a merger of sorts. The worship of the Lord of Light would adopt much of the organization and martial culture of the Seven, and the Westerosi followers would probably drop the forgiveness and tolerance the Seven provided. In time. The end of this conflict comes down to where the base of worship of the Red God is. We'll start with the obvious and work our way around. The Riverlands. This is the most likely spot thanks to the Knights of the Underhill. The Riverlands are fairly rich and populous. A little less after the War of the Five Kings, but rich and populous nonetheless. Using boats, they would have an easy time of travel and trade. Left unmolested, feeding armies would be easy. There's lots of castles and fairly good weather. The problem? Well, they'd be surrounded on all sides by enemies. Even given time to recover after the War of the Five Kings and the Three Queens, they'd still be doomed. The war, though bloody, would be almost laughably easy. Despite several strong castles, they're too centrally located and don't have the wealth or power to buy off the neighbors. The North probably couldn't be bought off. King's Landing is too close by to tolerate a hostile religion on its doorstep. The lands to the south and the lands to the west would join on the side of the king in order to gain new lands for their houses and families. The war would be over in a summer, with cleanup taking a few years, and the Riverlands would find themselves poorer with new residents and lords in the end. The Stormlands and the Reach. I'm grouping these two together because of the tight bonds between them. Yes, they fought wars in the past, but the way they're situated geographically and economically, if one converts to the religion of the Red God, I'm convinced the other will too. This is mostly due to the tightness of the nobility, which is where the spread would start. There is a lot of intermarriage between these two lands in particular. This creates an interesting scenario. If the followers of the Red God are able to co-opt the Citadel, they will be sitting on the greatest source of knowledge and technology on the continent. Bringing in the Arbor gives them the best food production as well. This would put House Baratheon, assuming they still exist, and House Tarly on the same side of the war. These two, in my opinion, are the most martial houses on the continent. Assuming they can keep the Tyrells out of important positions of military leadership, they could have the strongest and most competent military on the continent. This, I believe, is probably the best scenario for the followers of the Red God and would give them the best chance of converting the continent. This is dependent on several factors, one of those being converting both the Stormlands and the Reach together. While I don't believe this is hard as it sounds, they would also have to convert the maesters of the Citadel. Doing so would add temperance and patience to the spread. Basically, it would temper the more aggressive nature of the religion. This would allow it to spread further before fighting started, and possibly stop the fighting from starting altogether. This would also allow them to have agents in every great house in the land to act as spies and missionaries. This could even allow for the conversion of most of the great houses across the continental south, excluding Dorne. If they get the Citadel, they could win the war with little to no blood as they phased out the old religion and slowly replaced it, assuming they can keep their more violent tenants in check. If war does break out in this scenario, it's hard to say who would win, and it would greatly depend on the number of other lords and lands they were able to convert. Without the Citadel, the chances are good they would start the war too early and would end up much like in the Riverlands scenario. It would certainly be harder to take down this powerhouse, but I think it could and would be done. The most likely end to this scenario is one of the Lords of the Reach turning against the others and returning to the faith of the Seven. This would be so they could take power after the others who converted are betrayed and eventually eliminated. The Stormlands and the Reach would probably lose and return to the faith of the Seven under new and diminished management if they don't take the Citadel in the conversion. Dorne. This is a whole different kettle of fish. A Dorne converted to the Lord of Light has some great advantages. First, Dorne has fantastic defensive geography. The combination of deserts, mountains, and hostile natives makes invasion nearly impossible. All this literally turns Dorne into a graveyard for armies. Second, Dorne is fairly self-sufficient. Their position allows them to deny the lands north of them a lot of trade. Its position would make naval coordination for those against them literal hell. Messengers would have to cross a continent to exchange intel. It would delay the tactics of their enemies by possible months. There is a downside. Dorne is the least populous of all the Seven Kingdoms. The same geography that protects them does not lend itself to agriculture or large populations. This means while they could repel almost any invasion, they aren't mounting any either. Luckily, they would be spared the grisly fate of the Riverlands. The most likely result would be a slight impoverishment of Dorne, as trading from the north would be cut off. Trading from the east would most likely take up some of the slack. The north, however, would be greatly enriched as they would possess the only trade route to and from Essos. It is possible that due to a combination of political and economic pressure, Dorne could be persuaded to come back to the faith of the Seven. Dorne seems more obstinate than the other kingdoms and would probably just as likely stick to their new faith out of nothing more than spite. The Westerlands. Taking the wealthiest section of the continent certainly would seem like a boon. The wealth and influence of Casterly Rock would allow the religion to spread very quickly. They could easily plant adherents in nearby kingdoms and even in King's Landing. This could be as missionaries or troublemakers to soften targets. However, the Westerlands have a major problem. The combination of extreme wealth and religious zealotry would make them excessively arrogant. This, I believe, would cause them to start the war too early. If that happens, they will certainly lose. It's no secret and implied in the books that most of the other kingdoms find the Westermen a bit much. Add their worship of a heathen god and they would become downright insufferable. Peasants, lords, knights, and soldiers alike would veil their greed and disdain in faith, to liberate the lands of the West from the false red god. They would also liberate all the red gold mined from the hills. The Vale. This one is tricky. It has a lot of the same benefits of Dorne, but few of the drawbacks. It has greater food production, population, and capacity for armies. This, I believe, would be the bloodiest of all scenarios and take the longest to resolve. The Vale is isolated enough that it would make a magnificent echo chamber. It is self-sufficient enough to outlast any siege that can't get through the Bloody Gate, and so well defended, invasion is practically out of the question. The isolation has a downside. It would be very hard to spread outward to other kingdoms. Aside from trade, not much comes out of the Vale. They don't have major centers of learning, religion, or government that affects things outside their own lands. If a holy war were to break out between the Vale and the rest of Westeros, it would last for decades. Cracking the Bloody Gate is a tall order. The other option is staging a naval invasion of Goldtown. Naval invasions are some of the hardest military maneuvers known to man, and doing so with a medieval level of technology makes things worse. Crossing the mountains around the Vale with an army is basically suicide. Supplying them if they did cross it would be nearly impossible. And the "if they did cross" is a big if. Almost any approach to the Vale will basically become a meat grinder and will need to be absolutely massive. Keeping any foothold that's not breaking open the Bloody Gate would be very difficult because of supply lines. Even if they take the Bloody Gate, it's not much better. I can't predict a winner here. It's literally a situation where both sides could just block out the other and go about their lives. If left alone, the Vale would become a raider state, preying on its neighbors and returning to their country-sized natural fortress. If the other kingdoms did succeed in getting into the Vale with sufficient numbers, it would be horrifying. The loss of life on both sides would be akin to a major plague. The horror of winning the war would likely scar the society of Westeros, being remembered as a dark age argued about by scholars long into irrelevance. Dragonstone. We've kind of already seen what would happen in the books. After what happened with Stannis Baratheon, any foothold of the Red God would be immediately brought into suspicion, and it probably wouldn't go well. Even if it was tried again, it would probably be crushed with little to no hesitation. This is assuming the new lord would be dumb enough to try. So who would be the ultimate winner? In almost every scenario, the Religion of the Seven would probably win. The Red God has a few very choice scenarios, but in most cases they're simply outnumbered and outspent. There is only one scenario, in my opinion, where the Religion of the Red God dominates the continent. That scenario requires the capturing of the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Citadel, and spreading slowly through influence until they outnumber everyone else. This would take several generations and is complicated by the natural zealotry of the Religion of the Red God. There's also very little chance of outside help. There are no nations where the worship of the Red God is backed by the state, as far as we know. At best, they may get a few boatloads of zealots come over from Essos. This would slightly bolster the numbers, but depending on where the foothold is, this could be easily cut off. You also face the problem that these zealots would be seen as outsiders and act as propaganda for the non-converted kingdoms. The zealots would also probably be disgusted by the merger of their religion and that of the Seven that would most likely occur in Westeros, further decreasing aid from overseas. The speed of travel and communication greatly affects war and culture. Westeros is too distant, its culture is too homogeneous, to really be conquered by a religion that has yet to conquer a single city-state. As for conflict between the Seven and the Old Gods, that battle is already over. The Old Gods are a slowly dying religion. They have too few leaders, and the religion of the Southlands has already infiltrated their nobility. It may take centuries or more, but the North will be brought by degrees to the religion and culture of the South. Maybe not in full, but enough to ensure that there's little to no difference. Good luck, everyone.